Welcome in, everybody, to another live Patriots Beat Q&A. Evan Lazar, Alex Barth alongside, and Alex, a little bit of a dead period here in the offseason, a lull, if you will, of excitement. The Patriots making some back end of the roster moves the last couple of days, and adding to that what is now a full 90-man roster, at least for the time being, until the Patrick Chung retirement hits the books on June 1st. But we're kind of getting a little bit closer to OTAs. Next week, Badio will be allowed in for at least one practice, and then minicamp and OTAs will follow suit in June. Any of these signings, though, these last couple of days stand out to you? Anybody excite you at all that could sneak onto the roster here?
Well, the Tyler Gaffney one just excites me because he was like a fun player when he was here, right? And they just
Good
stole him from the Panthers and all that.
Yeah.
Good preseason player, yes. Now do Ralph Webb. The Hoyer one excites me a little bit. I just think
we haven't discussed that, so we can go into that.
So I think what that signing does in some ways is tell me that they are open to starting Mac Jones this year at some point, because you're bringing Brian Hoyer in to get Mac Jones ready.
Right.
That's why he's here. So it also tells me, and this is kind of, long walk for a short pier here, or long walk for a short story here, but it tells me that we might get the relaxed practice squad again. Hoyer to me would be the perfect candidate if they are going to let veterans on the practice squad and they are going to keep that number at 12 or 16 players, that we know how much they value him on the scout team. Nobody's probably going to try to steal him, although we heard today the Jets tried to sign him. But I think if you can get Hoyer on your practice squad and have him run the scout team and have him be around for Mac Jones, I think he ultimately makes you a better player without even stepping on the field, without even being active on game day. So I know people are kind of goofing on that signing, and I get it. But I do think does he suddenly make them the favorites for the division? No, that's not what this is. But were they a better football team after signing him than they were before signing him? Yes, I believe that.
Yeah, a lot of people were goofing on the signing, or at least looking way too much into the signing, right? And saying, okay, well, this means that Mac Jones is going to start early, and Cam Newton could be somebody that they could move, or Jarrett Stidham could be somebody that they could move. And we always want to get into the domino effect of what every single move could possibly mean on other people on the roster, when a lot of times it's just what's staring at you directly in the face, right? Where it's right. With Brian Hoyer, he is somebody that is going now on 7 years in the Patriots system. Outside of Tom Brady and Josh McDaniels, Brian Hoyer probably knows the Patriots playbook better than anybody. So if you have a young quarterback that you just drafted in the first round, he is the perfect guy to tutor and mentor that player. I'm not so sure, and it's no slight on Cam, but the way that Cam plays and the freestyling that he plays with, and just sort of the athleticism that he plays with, I'm not really sure that Cam is the right guy from an X's and O's standpoint to break down the game for Mac Jones, right? From a leadership standpoint, from a work ethic standpoint, all of that. I think that Cam Newton is a great example for Mac Jones. But in terms of the X's and O's, the playbook, the strategy, how to conduct yourself in terms of being a pocket passer, Brian Hoyer definitely knows a little bit more about that. The other thing that came out today that the Jets, Jeremy Fowler is saying that the Jets had interest in Brian Hoyer. I'm not sure if Robert Saleh overlapped with Brian Hoyer in San Francisco. I imagine he did so in some capacity, but that definitely tells you that with a team that has Zach Wilson and a young QB, the Jets also recognized that Brian Hoyer brings a lot to the table in terms of mentorship and tutelage and things like that behind the scenes for a young QB. So it's not just the Patriots that feel that Brian Hoyer can be that sort of guy. With the Jets in the past, Josh McCown got a lot of credit for being that guy with Sam Darnold. We've seen this in other places. So I think you got to look at it as a fourth quarterback going into training camp. That's a must, I think, for the Patriots, the way that they conduct camp. We're out there, Alex, there could be 3 or 4 different things going on at one time, right? You have the ones over on one field, you have the twos on another, you have another set of or group of players at the far end zone working on red zone work or running basic or something like that. And there's a whole lot going on. So having all these quarterbacks around can be very helpful. So I look at it in the short term, at least, as a camp arm with familiarity in the system. That's a good tutor for Mac Jones. let's wait and see what happens in camp in the preseason before we start talking about domino effects on Jared Stidham and Cam Newton and all those types of things. I understand that's where we always go, but that's truly the way that I feel about it, at least for the time being. So
I'll just to fill some holes in there. They did Hoyer and Solid did overlap briefly. In San Francisco. So 2017. So his first year was the year that San Francisco traded for Jimmy and cut Hoyer. I do want to address, I don't know if we're going to do a Q&A like totally. I do want to address something that was put in the chat because this has been a common talking point. If Brian Hoyer is just here to work with Mac Jones, why not make him a coach?
Yeah.
Maybe Brian Hoyer doesn't want to be a coach. How do we know they didn't approach him with that? First off, fourth string quarterback still makes probably 10 times the money that Hoyer would as a first-year coach. And he gets tenure. He's in the league longer. That helps with benefits down the road, things like that. And maybe he still wants to play, even if it's not in games. Maybe he's a guy that, even if it's just on the scout team, enjoys going out there and slinging it 3-4 days a week. And if the Jets will give him that chance or another team will give him that chance, why wouldn't he go take that? Why don't you just make him a coach? I feel like that's just a really easy way to say, or it's a really lazy way to say, I get why they signed him, but I don't want them to sign him. Like this is, if they wanted Brian Hoyer back as a coach, they would have asked him. And if it was coach or no go, if it was coach or he leaves the NFL entirely, you have to imagine he would have taken the coaching job. So why not hire him as a coach? Probably because he didn't want to be a coach and he wouldn't have signed on as a coach. It's
also a completely different job, right? Like being a coach, it's a completely different job. And if you're really going to kind of mentor or bring along Brian Hoyer, let's say they feel like he could be the quarterback's coach of the future, right? There's a whole lot of things behind the scenes, whether it's writing up, game tips or working on scout team or studying game tape and situational for the opponent, red zone, different types of things, third down, things like that. There's so many other responsibilities that go into those types of things. Tip sheets is a big one of them in terms of game dates type of stuff that Jed Fish did last year that filled in that for Josh McDaniels so McDaniels could do other things. There are so many other things besides just sitting down with the rookie quarterback and working with him day in and day out that an assistant coach on Bill Belichick's staff and Josh McDaniels' staff has to go through. The other point is, and I think Greg Bedard brought this up on the podcast on his podcast based on the chat, is that Brian Hoyer can go to that school that they go to in Brookline, who of course I'm blanking on right now, and work out with Mac Jones without any time restraints, right? Coaches, you can only see Mac Jones and work with Mac Jones during organized team activities, during mini camp, during training camp. So I think that's such a big part of it too, is that Mac Jones and Brian Hoyer, they can get dinner together. They can sit in the film watching film at each other's houses. They can go out to Dexter Southfield, which is the high school I'm trying to think of, and work out together there with Hunter Henry and Johnny Smith and maybe a couple of the receivers or something like that. All those types of off-season workaouts that we always talk about with the media, the coaches aren't there. Right. So you can't do those things as a coach. So I think that's a really big kind of part of this as well. So look, I get it. Brian Hoyer he's not going to start this year for the Patriots. Could there be a better usage of that roster spot potentially with somebody that could actually push to make the 53-man roster at another position? Maybe. But I think that there is a whole lot to be said. And Tom Brady said it himself. Like he gave so much credit to Brian Hoyer. After the Patriots beat the Rams in the Super Bowl a few years ago, they talked about how Brian Hoyer basically became Jared Goff for 10 days. Like he literally had all of Jared Goff's mannerisms and checks at the line of scrimmage and all the little different things that they do. He had it all down to a T, and that really prepared the defense to go out there and play. So Brian Hoyer is not here to play. Brian Hoyer is here to mentor. He's here to bring along young quarterbacks. He's here to be a good guy in the locker room. So we don't need to worry about his on-field performance because that's not why he's in the building. If
it gets to that point, there's bigger problems than Brian Hoyer's your quarterback.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get into some of these questions. And I just want to get to this question first and knock it out right at the beginning because I know we're going to get asked it a million times. Julio Jones. is there any chance the Patriots trade for Julio? And look, Mike Lombardi said on his podcast today that from his perspective, it does make a little bit of sense, right? The Patriots feel like they're a Julio Jones away from really being a contender, right? When they get that true number one X wide receiver, it puts everybody else that they signed this offseason into the proper order in the pecking order. It makes the tight ends' jobs easier. It makes Nelson Aguilar's job easier. You have a complete offense now with Julio on the outside. So for all those reasons, it makes a lot of schematic sense, and it definitely would put the Patriots in a different enchilada or a different tier, I would say, from a roster just on paper standpoint. But they also invested a ton of money in pass catchers this offseason, and this is another steep investment in a pass catcher. Where do you stand on the Julio stuff?
So, yeah, I mean, some of it comes down to the contract. Can you get him to rework his contract? Because his dead money is just gross right now. I'm pulling it up right here. It's $40 million. Well, I guess you would, if you trade from this year, you're not cutting him. But $23 million cap hit this year, $20 million cap hit with 17.5 of dead cap next year, and there's a $7 million out after that, after his age 33 season. So if you add, I'm going to kind of tie this into the Celtics a little bit. Like, let me use the Celtics as an analogy here. When the Celtics were, building that team, and they signed Horford and they signed Hayward and they drafted Tatum, right? When they added Kyrie Irving, and I'm not saying that Julio Jones, I know that there's baggage with Kyrie Irving. Let's just put that to the side for a second. When they went and they added that max player and they made that trade with Isaiah Thomas, right? That was kind of, at that point, it was cemented. This is the group. You're going to have to make a monumental change to alter this core. You're cementing that in they cemented that in as the group for 2 years. And if they'd had more flexibility, who knows? Maybe they're not in the spot they're in. I'm not saying Julio Jones would blow up like Kyrie. Don't take that out of context. What I'm saying is the way the roster is constructed right now, the way his contract looks right now, you have to be sure that we're not going to need to make any more big additions for the next 2 years. This is our core. You add Julio Jones, this is the core. And where that gets scary is where they're at the cornerback position, with Stefan Gilmore and J.C. Jackson both on 1-year deals. So if you can figure out a way to make his deal more friendly in the long term, Julio Jones is a tremendously talented player. Of course, if you can add him, go add him. Personally, to me, this just feels like a continuation of, it was Larry Fitzgerald every year for 3 or 4 years was coming to the Patriots. Yeah. And then it turned into Odell Beckham became the guy. And there's some overlap there. But Odell Beckham, for the last 2 off seasons coming into this one, we heard Odell Beckham, it's coming, Odell Beckham. And I feel like that torch has kind of been passed to Julio. Should they do it? Absolutely. Could they do it? There's a possibility. It feels a little bit like grasping at straws for me, but if they can do it, he's a tremendous player. It's just at 32 years old with that contract, you need to really be confident that you're going to be able to figure things out at other positions on the roster without major moves, because that's it. You're locking that in. This is the core. You're going forward, and not a bad core, but this is the group you're going forward with. Offensively, it's Julio, it's Jonnu Smith, it's Hunter Henry. Those are your big playmakers on the offensive side of the ball. And then defensively, you're focusing all your talent up front, and you're going to figure out how to piece that secondary together when Stefan Gilmore's contract expires, when J.C. Jackson's contract expires, when Devin McCourty, does he make it through that window? Do you still have him through that window? I think that's what you have to do. Again, I'm not saying no. I'm just saying that people are looking at it like it's Madden, where, we'll flip the switch for Julio Jones, whatever. There's massive roster ramifications because of that contract if you make this move. And I just think, this isn't just, Julio's good, let's go get him. You need to look at the big picture here before you pull the trigger on this.
Uncharacteristically aggressive, Alex.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
You don't run an uncharacteristically aggressive offseason, and then the Falcons, who are dangling Julio Jones out there at this point because of their salary cap being so tight up against the salary cap, they have no wiggle room. They want to move on from that contract. The Athletic reported today that they would like to trade Julio Jones if the right deal comes across the table. So you look at the deal and you say, it's a second-round pick for Julio Jones. Now now it's too rich, right? Like, now we've invested too much. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, if you're saying don't do it, that's what you're telling me, is that because we paid the tight ends, because we played Aguilar, because we played Kendrick Bourne, we can't invest any more at the pass catcher, at the receiver position.
Right. So I think that's true. I think that's true for like 95% of the players that were available, right?
Yeah.
The people, I mean, who else were people clamoring for them to sign? Like all these people, why don't they sign Golden Tate?
Right.
Why don't they sign, these sorts of guys?
Sure.
Then what you said is absolutely true. Julio Jones, if he's healthy, is even if he's 80% of what he was at his peak, which is probably about where he is right now, is a transcendent talent. And, that to me, second round pick, yes. I'm probably stopping at a first because, like I just said, you're more or less cooked in free agency at that point. And I think you're going to need a way to bring talent onto the roster. And I think those first round picks are valuable. Maybe a pick swap, a first for a second or something like that. I don't know that I'm giving up a top 30 pick. Second round pick, if it's like a second and a fourth for Julio Jones, yeah. I also think this is where you get creative. If they were to make this move, this is where you get, and this kind of goes against what I said, but just hang with me here. This is where you get creative with J.C. Jackson, Stefan Gilmore. Those two guys are both on expiring contracts right now. You can't let them both walk. Ideally, you extend both of them. That's probably not realistic. Ideally, you extend one and move one. And if that's maybe something you can facilitate here and bring in Julio Jones and use that as an excuse to get some long-term security at the cornerback position, maybe that's where you go with it. So, I don't know that that's what I do. That wouldn't be my first avenue to pursue it. But if we're going to have this conversation, Evan, if we're going to talk about Julio Jones, I think you need to talk about the cornerbacks, although you seem relatively put off by me floating that.
Yeah, I don't want to trade the cornerbacks because I have no idea who's going to play cornerback if the Patriots trade either one of those guys.
Something
are you going to put Juwan Williams out there?
But something has to happen with those guys one way or the other, no?
I guess. I mean, I don't know why. Like, you can play JC Jackson on his restricted free agent tender, like they've done with many different players.
What are you doing with Gilmore? What if they can't reach an extension with Gilmore?
If they can't reach an extension with Gilmore, and the only way that the Falcons will entertain a trade for Julio Jones is by including Gilmore, then I guess you have to have that conversation. But to me, if you're going to be able to get Julio Jones for just a draft pick, then you're hanging on to Gilmore and you're going for it, right? Like
that's fair. That's
the team. And I think this is the last thing I want to say about Julio is just, this is why you draft a quarterback in the first round and only pay Cam Newton $5.5 million, is so that you can go out there and spend $325 million in free agency and trades to retool the rest of the roster around the quarterback. You have the manageable asset at the quarterback position right now in Mac Jones. You have the cheap QB under contract for at least 4 years, if not 5 years, at a cost control value. That's the benefit of that. That's the beauty of that. And the other thing I'll just wrap it up with this is that with Julio, like, that's the icing on the cake, right? So I understand that he's had some injuries. I understand that he's older, but he's the icing on the cake. And if the way that it gets done to me for the Patriots is if Julio Jones is willing to rip up his current contract, play on a 1-year deal, and reset his value next offseason, right? Because there is a chance that he comes here. I'm not saying he's going to catch 20 touchdown passes, but he has like a Moss-like impact on the Patriots offense, and he signs one more big deal with a team that he wants to go to next offseason and kind of resets his value, because no team, the Falcons or the Patriots, are likely to continue with this contract that he's currently on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it comes down to. And the other thing with Julio, with the injuries, I think if he's not coming here, I can't imagine they would play him 85-90% of the offensive snaps.
Yeah.
It's probably more somewhere in the 60 to 70% range. Maybe you push 75. If you bring, because you have to remember, there's only between the tight ends and the running backs and the wide receivers. And I think this is the most forgotten point of the Patriots offseason, is there's only so many snaps. You can only have 5 skill position players on the field at a time, and there's only so many plays per game that you can come up with different alignments. So you're not bringing in Julio to be a hunter catch guy. You're bringing in Julio to spell with Jonnu Smith, to spell with Hunter Henry as an upgrade over Nelson Aguilar. And the idea is if you can keep 2 of those 3 guys on the field at all times, and you basically play 2 of those, you're playing 2/3 of that group every time, probably only keep putting all 3 on the field when you really need it. That's the plan here. It's to keep everybody healthy. You get better. Julio's not a platoon player by any means, but the idea is you're keeping everybody. You don't need him. I don't think the Patriots need him right now, right? He's not going to make or break things. Like you said, he's the cherry on top. You're bringing him in to put that offense on another echelon where guys are fresher, they're healthier, and they're competing better deeper into the season.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I want to move on here to one of the other quarterbacks. There was a Twitter rumor out there that the Houston Texans called the Patriots about Jarrett Stidham. Teams are not calling the Patriots about Jarrett Stidham. I can tell you that right now. I don't think the Texans were really ever calling the Patriots about Jarrett Stidham either. Jarrett Stidham right now has very little to no trade value. I don't think anybody is knocking on the Patriots door to try to trade for Jarrett Stidham. But in theory, Mac Jones beats out Jarrett Stidham in camp. You keep Brian Hoyer as the third QB or the practice squad QB. Cam's your starter to start the season. What do you do with Jarrett Stidham? I think that's a good question.
I think they will be able to trade him if they want to. I don't think they're getting a lot. I think it's Stidham in a 7th for a 6th, right? It's a late, below 200 pick swap. But he was a 4th round pick at one point. He did have a year under Brady. He does have 2 years under Bill. I can see some team looking at that. If there's a team that loved him going into the draft, looking at that and saying, you know what? Maybe we can figure it out, right? Some of these teams fall in love with quarterbacks before the draft. And maybe they think something, whatever it is, whether it was Brady or Bill or Cam or whatever, that, something happened in New England that, we saw this potential in him before the draft, and something happened in New England that he didn't get there. And we'll pay this small price to see if we can drag it out of him, right? Backup quarterbacks are, you can never have enough quarterbacks, especially guys with NFL experience, which Stidham has a little bit. Maybe a team has their backup get hurt during the preseason or something like that.
That's the way he has value, right? Is if somebody gets hurt in training camp for the preseason and a team needs a new backup quarterback, and maybe the Patriots can get something back for Jarrett.
Right. You're not getting a return on investment. I've seen people be like a 4th. No, it's a late day 3 pick swap. But I do think if they want to trade him, somebody will give up something to get him. Maybe it's you move up 5 spots in the draft. Like it might not be a ton, but I think that there's a way to do that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with Jarrett Stidham, though, is that Bill Belichick refusing to put him on the field last year was such a big indictment to Jarrett Stidham for everybody in the league. Like when everyone saw that and everybody you speak to, when they say, well, the Patriots were mathematically eliminated from the playoffs and Bill still wouldn't put him in. Like they still wouldn't start him. Cam was struggling a ton with the Patriots system and just with the whole thing. And Bill still wouldn't turn to Jarrett Stidham other than in mop-up duty or late in games or when he was absolutely forced to do it against Kansas City. The league trusts Bill Belichick's ability to evaluate quarterbacks. And the fact that Jarrett Stidham couldn't get on the field for him in a year where they needed a quarterback to play well and Cam was not playing well, that is certainly something that I think really paid a lot of dividends to everybody around the league. It was something that was very flashy to everybody around the league. So I think it's going to be difficult to move him unless you have a major injury or something in camp that ruins it for a team, their quarterback depth chart, and you have to reset there, and maybe you can move Jarrett Stidham at that point. The Patriots, I can see why all the reasons in the world why the Patriots would want to trade Jarrett Stidham. It just I don't see any value there for the Patriots to make that move. All right, we talked about Stefan Gilmore a little bit. This is sort of continues to be an under-talked about storyline here with the Patriots, and that is Stefan Gilmore right now, Alex, is set to make $7.3 million in cash for the Patriots in 2021. Defensive Player of the Year just 2 years ago, an All-Pro defender, still a very good cornerback. That's not enough money. And the big question here, and this is a good one, is he going to show up to mandatory mini camp in June? Is he going to want to play at all for the Patriots, or are we going to get ourselves into a holdout type of situation?
I mean, he shouldn't, if we're being honest, why should he play for $7 million? I'm not, you threw out the resume. He's worth much more than that. He's 30 years old, 31 years old.
Yeah.
If he plays on that, and then it's just play on that and then go get your contract in the spring. What if he gets hurt? He doesn't have enough, you have a serious injury, 31 years old at that position, you're not getting big money again. Probably not. I mean, maybe you have some incredible turnaround, whatever, but they're going to have to figure something out. And this is kind of what I was talking about before. You have JC Jackson on a 1-year deal, but like, I also wonder if JC Jackson's going to play for his tender or if he'll hold out. I don't know that he has the same pull that Gilmore does, but is he, what is it? It's like $3.2 million.
It's definitely an underpay, but they have come back around and paid those guys in the past, right? Like Jonathan Jones played on his restricted free agent tender, and then he signs his deal the next year. You know, they have made those guys whole. In the past.
So here's kind of the way I look at it. If I'm, in JC Jackson's camp, if Stefan Gilmore holds out, that's just all the more leverage for me, all the more leverage for JC Jackson. So they have 2 corners who are on 1-year deals who are severely underpaid. That's just like week 1. That's not going to be the case. I don't know how that gets resolved. You're not going to have Stefan Gilmore on one side for $7 million and JC Jackson on the other side for $3 million. Like maybe Jackson plays for his, I think is certainly more realistic than Gilmore's, but and that's why I'm surprised they haven't done anything at corner. They worked out Dre Kirkpatrick, who would, by the way, would be a very good addition, I think, regardless of what happens with the other guys. I think is a guy they should sign. But, there really is no backup plan. So those 2 guys have all the leverage. I wouldn't be shocked I wouldn't be shocked if Gilmore doesn't show up, to go back to the original question. I wouldn't be surprised. Like I said, I don't know what's happening with JC Jackson. I'm not, this isn't to smack his character. Again, go get what you're worth. Right. It's a
Stefan
business.
Gilmore almost didn't show up last year for training camp, right? So the Patriots had to incentivize his deal last year just to get him in the building for mandatory training camp in August, right? And there was obviously some weird stuff going on with COVID that messed up the whole offseason. So we might have found out about that in June in a normal season. We found out about it in early August because of the COVID stuff. And they had to incentivize his deal then. The Patriots are also sitting here, and look, if they trade for Julio Jones, then all the cap space goes away. But they're sitting here right now. Miguel has them at
like 15, right?
A shade over 15 million. They still have to make some of their rookie signings, Mac Jones, a couple of other guys. But point being, they have about $10-11 million in wiggle room once you get those rookie contracts in there. And Stefan Gilmore's got to be sitting there saying, like, you got the cap space. Like, you could just give me some incentive to show up here. I would actually be surprised if he does show up and plays for the current money that he's at. So I think this situation is definitely heading towards a holdout for Stefan Gilmore. And that's it's not the Patriots it's not the first time the Patriots have dealt with a holdout, right? I mean, Deion Branch held out, guys, Logan Mankins held out, like guys have held out in the past. It's not Bill's first rodeo with that, but for all the positive just vibes that you've gotten from your offseason and from your draft and all those types of things that you've been able to go out there and do, to have you're still your best defensive player come into camp as a holdout. I mean, that's not something that you really want to start on the right foot, right? You got all these guys in. Yeah, you're riding this big wave of this huge offseason. Let's take care of Stefan Gilmore or move Stefan Gilmore. Make a decision.
It's been the elephant in the room this offseason. And I was on a podcast yesterday, and they asked me about the quarterback situation, and they said the decision of the year. The quarterback situation is not that complicated. They're going to start Cam week 1, and probably for quite a bit after that. Like, Bill doesn't play rookies. The real question right now is what happens at corner. That is, that's been the looming question. And I guess it wasn't as prevalent early because you thought maybe they sign a guy in free agency. And then obviously we talked a ton about the corners in the draft and the top 60 picks and using the corner there. So, if they had taken a guy like an Eric Stokes, even if they'd moved up, taking a guy like J.C. Horn, this is a very different conversation. But they didn't address that. And again, if you want to talk about the quarterback situation, talk about it. It pretty much is what it is. I think we all have the feeling that Cam's going to be the starter week 1. What are the 2 outside corner starting spots going to look like week 1? I have no clue. I don't
know what the whole depth chart's going to look like. Like, Juwan Williams is really the only guy behind those guys.
We know what's going on in the slot. Outside, complete. That's the real mystery. Quarterback is what it is. If you want to talk about what is X position going to look like week 1, corner is a complete wild card.
Right. I mean, like, unless they're planning or maybe as an emergency would move Jalen Mills back outside, which is definitely not anything that any of us want. But if that ends up having to be the case, and then fine, I guess. Or maybe like a Mike Jackson pushes to make the roster or something like that. But like they have D'Angelo Ross. These guys are most of the other guys that they have on the team, other than the Mills and Jackson, are inside guys, but besides the top three. So you're really looking at a pretty thin group there. I only had 4 guys on my 53-man roster projection making from the cornerback group, because I think that there needs to be another addition to get a 5th guy on the team, because I don't think the other guys are worth it to carry on the roster. I don't feel that Mike Jackson is somebody that is worthy of being on a 53-man roster for the Patriots, especially how deep this team is. So I think that there has to be another domino there to fall as well. There's a lot of questions coming in now just about got different players on the Patriots roster and how they fit into this puzzle and things like that. So we can get to some of those. Josh Uche, really interesting rookie season, really interesting player, someone that was flashed and had some really great flashes of explosiveness and pass rush ability. Where do you see his ideal fit in the defense?
I mean, I don't know how many players we're going to do for the front 7, so I'm going to try to set myself up to not be repetitive here, but all over the place.
Yeah.
Hand in the ground, stand up outside linebacker, playing some middle linebacker as well. I think that's how you're going to make this team. There's so much talent. You can't be, I don't think you can go into camp and say, I'm the second most talented outside linebacker, so my role is the backup outside linebacker. Well, the third most, and I'm not saying Uche is any of these guys. This is just a general example.
Yeah.
Well, if you're the second best outside linebacker and you think you're the backup, well, the third best outside linebacker might also be able to play middle linebacker and a little bit of safety and special teams. Guess who's making the team between the two of you now? So, Uche's best role, I think, is similar to what he played last year, but I think he's going to need to play a heavier dose of inside linebacker if he wants to play as much as he did last year. Supplement what he did on, or more, supplement what he did on the outside by being able to, I don't know that he's putting his hand in the ground, not in a 3-4, at least not in the traditional sense. Maybe if they go with some smaller packages on like obvious passing downs, but if he can kick inside and give them some support inside, that's going to go a long way for him in his development in year 2.
So we spoke to him earlier this week, and he mentioned that he told teams that he wanted to be used like Dante Hightower, right? And he's not as physically imposing as Dante Hightower. He's not that thumper in the middle of the defense that Hightower is, but that's sort of on the line, off the line type of role where on first and second down or in run situations, if you will, he's playing inside backer. And then when they get into pass rush situations, you bring him onto the line of scrimmage, whether it's over the guards and over the center on the interior or over the tackle or outside the tackle on the outside. That I feel like is a role that he can definitely play from an athleticism and versatility standpoint, and would really be a lot of fun for the type of player that he is. So he's not exactly the same type of player, and he doesn't win in the same ways as Dante Hightower, but he almost has the same kind of versatility, or a potential versatility. So I think that that's sort of what they're looking at with him, as someone that's basically a middle linebacker at the core. His base role is as an inside linebacker off the line of scrimmage. Then when we get into second and long, 3rd and 8, those types of situations, what Josh Uche can bring in the pass rush, and that's when you have him flying off the football. And this is a lot of the reason why we talked so much about Chase Winovich being sort of in a battle here for to stay on the roster and stay on the football team. It's because a guy like Uche can do a lot of the things that Winnow can in terms of explosiveness, first step explosiveness, turning the corner and rushing the passer, and maybe has a little bit more of that experience and versatility to play off the line of scrimmage. So it's going to be a fun group of edge defenders / linebackers. You want to call them all linebackers, I guess. There's 9-10 guys there at those two spots that all deserve a say at the seat at the table in terms of making this roster. We haven't talked a lot about Adrian Phillips, like pretty much at all. And I guess maybe in this type of offseason you wouldn't. They do have a lot of these types of guys, though. And I read about this today where Jalen Mills, Kyle Duggar, Adrian Phillips, they draft Joshua Bledsoe, Miles Bryant. They have so many of these safety hybrid players, whatever you want to call them. Guys,
I would even add Colbert, Adrian Colbert, the guy who signed today.
Just these safety, linebacker, play him in the slot, play him in the box, maybe play him in some zones if they're a little bit less stress or a high leverage type of zone coverage down the field. And they have so many of these types of guys that it does feel like something has to give on the depth chart, and not all of them are going to make the team.
Yeah, so it's funny you say that. Adrian Phillips is kind of, good player, but I look at him as a guy who could potentially be a surprise cutter trade. He's got 1 year left on his deal. They'd save $3.5 million against the cap if they let him go. And like you said, there's just so many guys, right, that can kind of do what he did between Duggar. I think that's a perfect role for a guy like Jalen Mills. I actually, and we talked about this a little bit off the air, we both kind of like what Colbert can do.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a signing that I'm going to look a lot at come training camp. So I just, when you break it down and you look at, okay, is Adrian Phillips a better option this year than those guys? Yeah, he probably is. But again, it's so complicated. It's so competitive that you have to go beyond that. And what's the 5-year projection? And Adrian Phillips is going to be 30 years old. He's an expiring free agent at the end of the year. Are you letting go of a guy with maybe 2 or 3 years of tenure on his contract who's on his way up to keep Phillips, who you might lose next offseason? So, I really liked what I saw from Adrian Phillips last year. I did. I don't want this to come across as me saying, he sucks, cut him. They're going to have to let go of good football players this year. That's just what they're going to have to do. And Phillips plays a competitive position, and just with his contract situation, right? Jalen Mills signed for 4 years. Kyle Duggar's on his rookie deal. I'm missing one of the box safeties, but yeah, I just don't know. Again, Juwan Williams, he's not necessarily better than Phillips, but he can play some outside corner. I don't think Phillips is going to be able to do that. So when it gets down to the numbers crunch, I feel like Phillips is somebody who's going to have a really strong camp to justify keeping him on the roster. Yeah.
Or look, they have all these special teams only guys in the past, like guys like a Cody Davis, for example, right? Or Brandon King. Like maybe those guys end up being on the outside looking in, and you keep Phillips. I talked about this a little bit last week when we discussed like all these special teams guys and things like that. It's like, this is one of those years where like you almost feel like Matthew Slater and Justin Bethler are kind of like the only 2 kick game guys that you can like say are lost, right? And some of these other guys like Cody Davis and Brandon King, and
they gave Davis a decent amount of money.
They gave Davis, they would have, if they cut Davis, I think it would be like a $2.3 million dead cap hit to cut Davis, and it just I don't know, it's just crazy to me because like if you can't play at all in one other phase, like how do you justify keeping Cody Davis on this roster and cutting like a Dalton Keene or an Anthony Jennings? Like those are guys that you just took last year with top 100 picks, and you're cutting those guys for somebody that's only going to play covering kicks. And I get it. Bill Belichick loves his special teams guys, but you have so many other guys on the roster, like an Adrian Phillips, like a Gunnar Olszewski, that all over the team, Brandon Bolden, that can do more than just that, right? That can contribute in the kicking game, can play 4 or 5 different units, but they can also play running back in a pinch, or they can also play linebacker / safety like Adrian Phillips, or they can also play slot receiver like Gunnar. So it just feels to me like this should be the year where they prioritize keeping some of this talent rather than keeping all of these kick game dudes.
Well, somebody just brought up in the chat, if you want to pull this up, this is another really good example of what you were just talking about, Juwan Bentley.
Yeah,
he's on another guy who, again, like Phillips, is on the last year of his deal. Juwan Bentley's not going out there and covering kicks. At least we haven't seen it. You look at the guys that they've brought in behind him. Raekwon McMillan can play middle linebacker in the NFL. Is he as good as Bentley? It's not a massive drop off, but he has significant special teams experience. Harvey Longey's another guy who can play inside.
Played a lot of
special Therese Hall can play special teams. Harvey Longey, who's a guy who was brought in the second wave of free agency, he can play inside linebacker, he can play outside linebacker, he can play little defensive end, and he can play on special teams. That's the kind of guy that is at an advantage with a roster like this. It's not the guy who's good at one spot. It's the guy, or it's not the guy who's really good at one spot. It's the guy who's good at 5 or 6 different spots.
Yeah.
Those are the guys you need to look at. So yeah, with Bentley, he's another. I don't think they'd cut him because he's a good player, and they're not just going to let him go for nothing. I could see them trading him because he is going to have value.
Houston, some of these Belichick disciple locations.
New York, I think, could use a linebacker, and that's Joe. Like, and I'll say the same for Phillips too. Like, and I'll throw even guys like Sony Michel and N'Keal Harry into this. there's guys that we talk about as not being roster locks. They're not cutting Sony Michel. They're not cutting N'Keal Harry, but these guys will have some value. It might not be a ton. You're not going to get a first round pick back for N'Keal Harry, obviously, but and a guy like Bentley too, where there's going to be some value elsewhere. You can trade them. You can get them off the roster while still getting something in return. So Bentley, I don't think Bentley gets cut. I would be shocked if Bentley got cut. Do I think he could get traded? Absolutely. Yeah.
And just to quickly, Gunnar Olszewski is not going anywhere. We don't think Gunnar
is getting cut. You're not getting rid of an all-pro.
No, you're not cutting Gunnar. We're just saying that Gunnar actually brings something to the table other than returning punts potentially, which makes his value even more so than just in terms of that. All right. We've talked a lot about Dalton Keene. I mean, I don't know if we have to go over our takes on Dalton Keene again. That's one of the questions here. Tight ends, how many tight ends they're going to keep. We've discussed that a little bit in the past as well. I'm just scrolling through to see the Richard Sherman stuff. Like, I know we did this last week as well, I believe, but like, I just don't get it. Like, I don't get, like, I get
what, the hype, or that he's not signed?
No, I don't get the, like I get that Belichick likes, in the past, has taken a chance on like a flyer on these veterans, right? It's the Chad Ochocinco, the Joey Galloway.
He's not just a veteran. He's built physically. I mean, he's a big, long, physical corner.
But he's a zone corner. Like, he's a zone corner. And I don't know, like, from everything that we saw out of him in San Francisco, like, does he actually have does he have it anymore, right? Does he have the speed anymore to carry guys down the field vertically, to change directions? Does he have the athleticism and the foot speed to play at a high level like the old Richard Sherman? And he's playing in these Seattle-style cover 3 systems his whole career, and now we're going to put him in press man 65% of the time. It just doesn't really. He's old and he doesn't fit. So I just don't really understand it. Like, I understand that, like, a lot of Seattle's principles and cover 3 especially were match principles. So they're locking onto their guys, especially when he's on the backside of the formation. They're playing Mabel. He's playing that guy straight up one-on-one, but it's still not the same as playing a guy in press man coverage and with divider leverage and things like that. So I don't know. I just don't really see the fit in the system, and it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, just to play devil's advocate here, I mean, I see where you're coming from, but we have this. So I'm going to go completely out of left field here.
Okay.
We've seen in the past these, corners, Hall of Fame caliber corners who late in their career, they kind of lose a step and they're able to extend their carear as much as 4 or 5 years by playing safety.
Yeah.
Charles Woodson did it. Rod Woodson did it. Jason Sehorn did it.
Richard Sherman come in here and guard tight ends? Like, could that be the role for him? And so, yeah, maybe he's not like fast enough to play on the outside anymore.
Right. I'm not bringing him in to replace Gilmore or Jackson, but I think Charles Woodson's a great. I know that they are different players in their day, but I think Charles Woodson's a great example where Charles Woodson probably extended his career by half a decade by adjusting his game to start to play safety. And I don't think he made that move till he was about 34, 35. Sherman, I think, is 32. I'll double check that. But Bill's a historian of the game. I'm sure he's aware of these scenarios. It's kind of common. Sherman just turned 33. So that, if you want to pound the table for Richard Sherman, and I wouldn't hate it if they brought him in, I think he still has something left in the tank. If you could figure out a way to bring him in and figure out a role for him as a safety, that would be the path if you want to go that route.
So remember last season, Aqib Talib went on a podcast and said that Bill tried to get him to not retire and come cover tight end.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
That's like the role. If they're going to make Sherman happen and they're insistent on Richard Sherman, that's what I see. Like, I see a guy that is going to have to change it up, right? And he's going to have to go out there and cover tight ends. And maybe Bill Belichick sees, like he saw with Aqib Talib, that he's got size. He's a physical corner. He has all these things going for him. And maybe they can see him as a tight end stopper. And I wrote about it today where, like, they might want to let Kyle Duggar roam around the field a little bit more and kind of be that Rodney Harrison, player in the hole. That's kind of a rover type of defender. They might try Jalen Mills at that spot, but I'm not totally sold that he's going to work out there. So maybe Richard Sherman can come in and lock down tight ends for Bill Belichick for a year. And maybe being on the outside isn't what he's meant to do anymore. But with tight ends, they're slower players, they're bigger players. You're not dealing with necessarily the same quickness or speed that you're dealing with wideouts on the outside. That's how I could sell myself on Richard Sherman. If that's the role they have in mind, is what they tried to convince Aqib Talib to come back to do, then maybe I can sit here and say that I can see it a little bit with Richard Sherman.
Yeah, so that's right. And I see people saying like, "Oh, he doesn't want to hit." Guy was in the Legion of Boom. Yeah. I mean, he's not.
That's hogwash.
He's not Cam Chancellor, but he's not playing
the smoke. All right.
You're not when I say convert him to safety, it's not like the Patriots middle linebacker safeties that I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, we're talking about a guy that's going to go out there and is like, all right, week one, Richard Sherman, you have Mike Gesicki. Like, that's your guy, right? You know, like that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about I find it I forgot about that Aqib Talib thing, and for some reason, this whole tight end.
No, that's a good
brought that back, and that's like that's it. Maybe that's the role that they can convince Richard Sherman to take, because that could add another couple years onto Richard Sherman's career, because he's a very good coverage player that's now playing against lesser route runners and guys that are not as quick and as explosive necessarily as those guys on the outside. All right.
If you have any more corners that move to safety, because now I'm like trying to think about this. I know Rod Woodson's the big one, or Charles Woodson's the big one, but leave him in the chat or tweet him at me, because now like I want to come up with this list.
Yeah, corners that, I mean, obviously Devin McCourty did it.
But I mean like the Leighton career kind of, I'm not as fast, so let me get a 15-yard head start by playing at the back of the defense.
Yeah, that feels like we talk about that a lot, but like it doesn't actually happen as often as we make it sound like it happens. You know what I mean? Like I feel like
so it happens a lot. How much it works is probably more limited, but
everything is more limited than people make it out to see. I would say we already talked about Julio Jones earlier in the show. If you wanted to go back there, if you have any more questions, drop them in the chat and we'll get to them. But I think that is going to wrap it up here in a second.
Wait, we got to do our Bruins minute.
Oh, I want to do the Bruins minute. Let's do a Bruins minute, and then if any more questions roll in here at the end, then we can get to that. Bruins minute. I just got to say, I absolutely love watching this team play hockey. I love playoff hockey, but this team in particular, just like we've seen it in the past, the teams that go deep in the NHL playoffs, you got to have some grit, you got to have some mental toughness, and you got to have a good goalie. And the Bruins check all those boxes. Last night, they were down twice in that game, right? They could have bowed out. They didn't. They come back and win it in overtime. I mean, just such a great team to watch and such a gritty team to watch. I love everything about the Bruins.
Yeah, and I love the Taylor Hall acquisition. Year after year after year with these trade deadline deals, where some of them worked out in the regular season, right? Like Rick Nash was really good at, like, I think he had like 9 goals in 11 games or something. Maybe it's 9 points in the regular season, but then disappeared in the playoffs. Taylor Hall showing the hell up, man. He's been awesome. I texted my brother this morning. Is Taylor Hall in the conversation for the best Boston sports acquisition since Stefan Gilmore in 2017? He pointed out JD Martinez was slightly after Gilmore. So far it's JD, but if Hall keeps it up and then signs an extension, I mean, he's on that path. So, and some of the other guys they brought in, you're not a cousin, Curtis Lazar, playing quality fourth line minutes. I think I'm blanking on the name of the Mike Riley, the defenseman they signed, I think has been a great under the radar addition. They really went for it this year. We've kind of been, they like last year, right? Andre Kasha was like a kind of half-ass move. And then he ultimately doesn't end up playing. We've been asking them for years, just go for it. Just go for it. They went for it this year, and it's, it's still early, but it looks like it's paying off so far. Those deadline moves are working out. They're making things easier for, some of the other guys on the roster. It's been great. And yeah, the goal was insane. Taylor Hall. I'm a sucker for a behind the back pass. That was great. Craig Smith, when people I remember in the fall, people saying Craig Smith, oh, that's your big addition. Craig Smith, a third line winger from Ottawa. What are you doing? Craig Smith has been great. Craig Smith has been an excellent player. Also helped me win my fantasy hockey championship. So
I saw on Twitter a video footage of Craig Smith, like basically from like the all 22 in hockey, right?
Yeah.
And last night,
all 12.
Yeah, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And he comes off the bench and just beelines it for behind the net straight from the bench, basically. Like just a full-on sprint from the Bruins bench straight behind the net. And
Was the overtime goal?
Yeah, the game winner. And the reason why the defenseman behind the net took his sweet time is because he knew the Bruins were taking a line change, and he didn't think that anybody would be on him. And Craig Smith hauled ass so hard off the bench that he beat the defender who was like 10 feet away from the puck at the start to the puck behind the net. I mean, that's like
just wanted it more.
Ultimate hustle right there.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And
that was great.
That's what we love in Boston. Like whether you're Patriots, Celtics, Bruins, Red Sox, like guys that just give out all out effort like that is always just amazing to see. We're getting, of course, like real Patriots questions in the chat as we're like going on about Craig Smith and the Bruins. We can answer. Let's answer two more quick ones here. This one, I guess, was asked already and we missed it. The old Foxborough flu, right? Who's the player that the Patriots find a way to redshirt so that they can keep him for next season?
Oh, it's McGrone. It's Cameron. Or is that?
That doesn't count because we know that one's happening.
Just in case anybody didn't see, Cameron McGrone tore his ACL in November last year. Bill basically said after the draft that he's not going to play this year. If it's not Cameron McGrone, maybe one of the offensive linemen. Maybe a guy like William Sherman, because they have. I hate to go back to the rookies, but Trey Nixon. It's Trey Nixon.
I was just you still might. Trey Nixon.
Okay, so I'll go with William Sherman. You can have Trey Nixon. They still have Justin Herron. They have Ted Karras on a 1-year deal. I think they're okay on the offensive line where they're at right now. So maybe Sherman's a guy, but Nixon, there's just not a ton of snaps at receiver, but he does seem to have some upside. So I'd really I don't think he can make an impact this year. I think he can make an impact in 2 or 3 years, but you got to figure out how to keep him around.
Yeah, so Trey Nixon's the guy. Like Trey Nixon is the player to me that's going to have a good first couple of weeks of camp because he has a lot going for him. And I actually spoke to his position coach today, and I'm going to have a piece on Monday about Trey Nixon. His position coach is really high on him. He said that they had 5 drafted guys this past year from UCF, Richie Grant at the top of the draft and some other players sprinkled in there. And fall camp last year, best player on the field at UCF camp was Trey Nixon. And they go into the season, very first game against Georgia Tech. He gets landed on awkwardly by the corner, breaks his collarbone. The whole thing, goes off the rails from there. And I think that he's a player that has a ton of upside, a ton of potential, really good vertical speed. UCF ran a vertical offense that saw a lot of press man coverage. So they faced a lot of press man, and he's very good at getting on and off press man. So I think that's an ability that he has as well. So I think he's the perfect kind of player that stars for a couple of weeks in training camp. They see that they have something there, and all of a sudden he tweaks a hammy and he's on IR, right? Right. That's exactly the type of guy. And maybe once they're ready to move on from like a Nelson Aguilar, for example, or N'Keal Harry gets moved or something like that by 2022, there's a role and a spot for a guy like Trey Nixon. So I definitely think it's Trey Nixon. And be on the lookout for that feature on Monday with his position coach. It was a good chat with Coach Wyatt, and they've had quite the success at UCF with wide receivers. That's kind of like an underrated wide receiver school. Brandon Marshall, Brashad Perryman, Traquan Smith, Seth, Gabriel Davis. They had a couple of guys drafted this year along with Nixon. So it's a really underrated wide receiver school. And Alex, on the podcast on Tuesday, we're going to figure out things to talk about, whether there's a ton to talk about or not. Hopefully, both of us will be able to go to OTAs next week on Thursday. So on Tuesday, maybe we'll discuss some things that we're going to be looking for on Thursday at OTAs, and then we could do a pod on Thursday, hopefully maybe Friday, depending on the OTA schedule, recapping what we saw at that day of OTAs. So we're really close. We're inching closer to actual football, like seeing players on the field, not quite in pads yet, but helmets and shells, right? And seeing some real formations in live action football. So we're getting there. It's going to be a little bit of a grind here, waiting for all these acquisitions to get together, but we're very, very close to seeing some actual football. So Alex and I will be back on the podcast on Tuesday, talking OTAs, previewing what we're going to see at OTAs next week. And then obviously we'll be back on Thursday for our usual pod as well on Thursday evening. So thanks a lot for joining us tonight. Thanks for all your questions and for allowing us to indulge ourselves in a Bruins minute there at the end. That was a lot of fun. Go Bees, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks, everybody.